So then let me introduce the speaker. So for those of you who do not know Sasanka, or an archaeologist, although this is a webinar on history and interpreting history and approaching history and engaging with history. And we are inviting Sasanka just for that same reason. Sasanka is a trained sociologist who has nevertheless dealt with the topic of past. He has an impressive record of publications on the topic, including Violence and the Burden of Memory, Remembrance and Erasure in Sinhala Consciousness, which came out in 2015, War Zone Tourism in Sri Lanka, Tales from Darker Places in Paradise in 2016, and his most recent, The Fear of the Visual, Photography, Anthropology, and Anxiety, which came out in 2020, in case you missed this. So Sasanka is also someone who inspires a younger generation of sociologists to go beyond and transcend disciplinary boundaries in academia. So we are very, very happy to welcome Sasanka. May I please ask you to switch on your video camera and take over the floor.
Okay, Hasini, thank you very much. And good afternoon to everybody, or good evening. I keep forgetting these finer points of the English language. Okay, before, one of the problems is going to be that I will not see anything on the screen because I'm going to be looking at my notes. As a result, if I goof up anything and switch off audio or video, somebody will have to let me know. I just, when I was reading for this presentation, I was reading, none of which I have brought into today's conversation, but I was reading people like Sudarshan Seneviratne and Kartigesu Indrapal. And I just want to tell you this, Hasini, if this program has some kind of a afterlife or a future beyond these 6 webinars, I think one of the things that needs to be done is to bring the work of these kinds of scholars who are obviously much better trained formally in history and archaeology than any of the 6 speakers who are speaking on this panel. Because the problem is that their work, which I think is crucial when you are looking at the Sri Lankan past, which are not emotional ways of looking at the Sri Lankan past, are not generally available to most of our people because much of it is written in English. So I think if there is an afterlife of this seminar webinar series, one of the things that ought to be thought about is at least to bring the shorter essays of these kinds of scholars into Sinhala and Tamil. And then, I think that would last, it'll probably be far more long lasting than, let's say, a conversation like this. And this I thought I should tell. Now, coming back to today's discussion, as Hasini was saying, I'm not a person who deals with the past as a matter of disciplinary interest or training. As a sociologist, I obviously deal with the present. My interest is very much in the present. Now, but the present is not an unconnected time zone, so clinically removed from other temporalities, whether they are in the past or in the future. That is, the present has references to the past as much as it also has anticipations of the future. So when I focus on the present, I'm often taken to the past simply because what I see in the present has direct or assumed connections to the past. And for me, without looking at these connections, the story I want to narrate about the present will not be complete. It will not be nuanced or reflective. So the past in this case, in my case, when I'm looking at the past as a non-historian, maybe the recent past in the 1980s, when I'm looking at the politics of contemporary visual art, that is the time very politically conscious art made its presence felt in the country for the first time, not only as a means of expression, but also because artists thought of themselves as interventionists and political actors. Similarly, the past I venture into could well be the late colonial period or as far back as the 4th century AD when I am dealing with contemporary pilgrim practices of Sri Lankan Buddhists. This is because the oldest references to Sri Lankans traveling to what is known as India today on pilgrimage come from the 4th century, but more consistently and more reliably since the 1890s. So these are the kinds of circumstances when someone like me with an interest in the present may venture into the past. So about today in specific detail, I want to simply talk about two positions, which I think are a kind of common senses, but important common senses when I or anybody else deals with the past. And later, if there is time, I would also like to talk about one of my recent forays into the past while I was working very much in the present and on the present. Now, I will ask Hasini at some point whether I have the time. If not, I will not go there. So the two common sense positions that I think is very important are these. One, the past is always in the present and not in the past as such. And two, the past is always in fragments and incomplete and therefore open to all sorts of interpretations. Now, any historian would know this. But the problem is today, whether in Sri Lanka or anywhere else, the dealing with the past is not only a matter for formally trained historians, but it is also a popular pastime. And the people who deal with the popular interpretations oftentimes have far more influence. So, so that is why I refer to these two as common senses, which anybody who looks at the past, whether they are regular people or whether they are trained historians, should be paying attention. In presenting my ideas, I am mostly drawing from three texts simply because they capture the essence of what I have to say today. One of these is the thesis on the philosophy of history by Walter Benjamin. The second is Between Past and Future by Hannah Arendt. And both of these are widely available. And the third is something called The Presence of the Past in the Present that I wrote in 1999. And I'm drawing from all three of these essays. And the other reason I picked these things is because all of these are written on the past by people who are non-historians. Walter Benjamin in Thesis on the Philosophy of History notes, the true picture of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashed up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. So the past, when seen from the present, is always fragmented and incomplete. Due to this fragmented nature, the past is open to numerous interpretations over time by different groups of people with very different political aspirations. That is why, in most of South Asia and beyond, the historical presence of people in specific places tend to be matters of contested interpretations. These contestations often revolve around questions such as who came to a particular place first, where, when, and so on. So, whatever actually happened in the past itself, in the present, is generally a site of contestation. What I'm trying to say is, what happened in the past is not really an issue, right? What is an issue is how that past is seen from the present. ideally, the way formal, unemotional, and post-enlightenment historiography would let us believe, history should be dealing with the truth about the past. But in practice, bringing the past into the present is often not about the truth. It is more about power. Who has the power to bring which part of the past into the present, and which part of the past would be erased and why? But partly, this partiality also manifests because we do not have easy and reliable access to what happened in specific periods of time. We also have access to, we only have access to fragments of possibly much larger narratives. And the interpretations we might make can always have very obvious gaps. More beyond this, humans have the capacity to write, reconstruct, or completely invent the past, depending on political necessities of the present. So this is why I keep saying that the present is crucial in understanding the past. And people very often do exactly this. Equally as often, it is based on such reconstructed and reinvented past that the present is perceived and the futures are planned. The past is also not simply about what happened in bygone times. That is, it is not only about the past per se. What happened in the past always and only exists in the present. If there is no present, somehow there can simply be no past. This is what Benjamin had in mind when he noted historicism contents itself with establishing a causal connection between various moments in history. But no fact that is a cause is for that very reason historical. It becomes historical posthumously, as it were, through events that may have been separated from it by thousands of years. He also noted history is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous, empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now. That is today's conditions that it is today's conditions that create the lenses through which we look at and perceive the past, particularly when it comes to popular and politically defined histories. Let me take a specific example from our understanding of the Sri Lankan past. And this everybody knows about the battle between King Dutugamunu, who ruled from BC 161 to 137, and King Elara, or Ilalan as he is also known in Tamil, who ruled from 205 to 161. Now, in today's reckoning of the past, tempered with competing Sinhala and Tamil nationalisms, the battle in 161 BC is seen as an epic battle between the Sinhala king Dutugamunu and the Tamil king Elara, right? In popular perception, it is supposed to epitomize the Sinhala-Tamil conflict even in that distant past. But Sinhala and Tamil ethno-cultural identities as we know them today had not evolved in 161 BC. Elara was certainly someone who had invaded Anuradhapura from what we refer to as South India today, but since he ruled nearly for 40 years, he must have had considerable local support as well. Mahavamsa, the Pali Chronicle of the Sinhalas, refers to him as a just king, even as it also valorizes King Dutugamunu. Give me a second. Somebody is trying to call me from. Okay. The temperament in which the battle is recorded in the main Pali chronicles of Sri Lanka is strikingly different from one to another. And this is something you should read if you are interested in interpreting the past. The Deepavamsa The oldest of these, written about between 3rd and 4th centuries AD, refers to the whole incident in a very brief reference. My recollection is it's probably one line or little para. It says basically, after the demise of one noble king, the other noble king took over, something to that effect. The Mahavamsa, written in 5th century AD, gives considerable detail from the preparation for war by Dutugamunu, the battle itself, the monumentalization of Elara by Dutugamunu after his death, and so on. But it is very clear, even in the Mahavamsa, that Elara was a just king, though some of his officers were not. This is what the Mahavamsa says. When it comes to Chulavamsa, the most recent of these chronicles, written in 1125, about the same battle, Elara had become a villain, an unjust and cruel king. And of course, a considerable violence is also presented in the text. Now, the question is, how does one explain the rather obvious differences in the temperament in referring to this co-event? There's a single event, all three texts refer to it in distinctly different ways. Professor Indrakirti Sirivira, initially writing in the 1970s and later in the 1980s as well, suggests when the Dipavamsa was written, Anuradhapura had been a powerful kingdom that had lasted for nearly 1,200 years. Though invasions had happened towards the end, they were perhaps not emotionally a major issue as they had become later, when invasions had become more frequent and much more destructive. So when Mahavamsa was written, the destruction from these invasions were more clearly felt. And more so when the Chulavamsa was written, Anuradhapura had already fallen. So his argument was that the compilations were initially, that the feelings and experiences of the times in which the compilations were initially undertaken were injected into the events they describe. Now, I think the same thing is possibly happening now. In the popular ways in which this same incident is perceived today, whether it's on television kind of history programs, newspaper articles, and in the way the event is described in textbooks, seem to take the combination of the ethos in the Mahavamsa and the Chulavamsa than the really matter-of-fact, very abstract attitude in the earliest of the chronicle, which is Dipavamsa. And this emotional slant comes not from the past that is described, but from the present circumstances of our interethnic relations and anxieties. Now, of course, what Professor Sirivira has suggested are not necessarily facts, but these are the kinds of inferences you can make by looking at what exists in the text and in our historical record. The other thing that we have to be aware of when looking at the past is that it is also replete with numerous erasures. For instance, in the construction of both popular and more formal histories, as well as mythic past, memories and lives of some individuals are often erased or de-emphasized, particularly if these individuals are people without access to power. Instead, what is presented or what is made available are mega narratives of the past. That is, selective histories of very powerful individuals are given the privilege to represent a larger collective. These are generally kings, warriors, leaders, and so on and so forth. They are also often victors and not losers. Let me take the example of King Dutugamunu again. As we know, he ruled from 161 to 137 BC. That is one example. The second example I want to take is King Parakramabahu, who was ruling from Polonnaruwa from 1153 to 1186 AD. The former is known as a warrior, a builder of monuments, and a great benefactor of Buddhism. The second is also known as a warrior who took some of his battles overseas as well, a builder of religious edifices, benefactor of Buddhism, and builder of complex irrigation systems. Now we know most of this information from both Mahavamsa-like chronicles as well as some contemporary inscriptions. What we know about the public lives of these kings, I think, is fairly reliable insofar as we stick to what the evidence suggests. But I know there are also silences. If you want to, we can talk about it later. But the question is, these monarchs by themselves cannot represent the societies of their times in all their complexities. For instance, we hardly know what the living conditions of ordinary people were at the time. We know very little about the structure of social organization at the time, except that caste must have played a major role. We can assume that the kings had access to significant resources and wealth to be able to do what they have done. We also assume they had access to systems of control to manage their people in the numbers that was needed for the constructions they have done. These are reasonable assumptions that can be made on the basis of other information that is available, but there is no direct evidence to clearly reconstruct the nature of civilian life at these times. This is a very large gap about the past. This is an obvious erasure, which we seem to have taken for granted. So when we refer to the past today in all its glory, we are actually talking about the past that we know about individuals, like some of these kings, not about the regular people. So to reiterate, the past is never complete or total picture. It's full of gaps. As Benjamin notes, only a redeemed mankind received the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for the redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all its moments. Obviously, this is never possible. Benjamin was in fact referring to what I would call an impossibility. It is in this incompleteness of the past that difficulties of the past manifest themselves in the present. Further, according to Benjamin, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize the way it really was. Even though today, when we are looking at the past with all of its fragments and incompletenesses, we assume, particularly at the popular level and at the in the political discourses, that we are seeing the entire past. So what I tried to do so far is to establish these two simple commonsensical positions about the past that is fragmented and therefore open for multiple interpretations, and that the past generally manifests in the present, right? And I'm saying this because these common senses are generally the first casualties when we look at the past at the popular level and increasingly even in scholarship. Now, this is the basic premise upon which I wanted to suggest that people start thinking. Now, this is also the time for me to go to my second part. And Hasini, do I have time? Okay, I'm going to proceed.
Yes, yeah. Yes, you have time. Sorry.
How much time do I have?
You can go up to 15 minutes if you like.
Fine. You need to stop me because I'm usually good at timekeeping, but as I told you, in this godforsaken technology, I'm never really too sure. All right?
So, yes, I will, Sasa.
All right.
I definitely will. Yeah.
Good. Now, so far I talked to you in kind of abstract terms, in kind of conceptual terms, and what I also said was common sense. Now I want to take you to the past. in the way that I have gone to the past in the recent times, while I was working on something very contemporary. I just want to show why this kind of thing becomes useful and how careful one has to be. Now, my interest for the last couple of years as a sociologist has been on pilgrimage, Sri Lankan Buddhist pilgrimage to parts of India and parts of Nepal. So it's very contemporary practice. And basically, what I wanted to look at is this. When these mass of people go to India and Nepal to retrace the steps of the Buddha, I mean, I've seen people doing this trip very often, particularly when I'm transiting in airports in this part of the world. And I have seen some pretty interesting things. One is that people seem to take a whole lot of their cultural baggage, including their food, and a certain sense of familiarity with them to India and Nepal. So that is why a lot of these more popular trips also involves cooking most of that Sri Lankan food. So in a way, they transcend international borders, but culturally they are taking a lot of their own material with them, cultural paraphernalia with them, right? They don't necessarily eat Indian food. They do cook Sri Lankan food. And second is that we assume that statecraft plays a major role in it, because after all, everybody has to get a visa from the governments of India and Nepal. But there are also very interesting relaxations of this. For example, a lot of uncooked food is being taken to both of these countries, and oftentimes you're not supposed to do this because of quarantine issues and so on and so forth. But they are generally relaxed. So my interest was to simply look at whether it was possible to theorize the nature of the state by looking at the ways in which these travels have been organized. So this is very much in the present. Now, why is it that while looking at this very contemporary phenomenon, why did I want to go to the past? I think there are two different kinds of past that I had to go. One was the colonial past. It is very easy to explain because today's pilgrim practice starts from that time. If the reformer Anagarika Dharmapala was not based in Calcutta in the latter part of the 19th century, and if he had not set up Mahabodhi Society of India, which we know functioned as a kind of a travel agency at that time because he encouraged pilgrimage, the present manifestation of pilgrim travel may not have started in this form. So obviously, and it's full, his diaries and newspaper articles in Sinhala Bauddha and the Mahabodhi Journal is full of references to these people coming from all parts of Sri Lanka. And there are also references to guides, tour guides, even in the early part of the 20th century. So to go into the colonial period was a natural thing that I had to do. But one thing I noticed, reading Dharmapala's records, is that there were constant references to, I mean, in his mind, he was not trying to introduce pilgrimage. He was trying to reinvent pilgrimage. And there were all these references to monks from Sri Lanka traveling to India in the ancient past. But of course, there were no references to specific times. So I started looking whether there are references, because as a non-historian, I was not familiar with this material. I was familiar with Dharmapala, but not beyond that. Then I actually came across a whole lot of very different texts, which gives a kind of a reference to a very, post 4th century familiarization or familiarity with the Buddhist landscape of India and Nepal. And the first text that I came across, and this is very well known to Sinhala scholars, is something called the Sihala Vattu Pakarana. It is a very short a book of little stories. Some people say it's older than the Mahavamsa, and this is written in Pali. And the second thing that I came across is something called Sahasavattu Pakarana. All these are in Pali, right? And the third is something called the Rasavani, which most people have heard of. That is in the 13th century. Now, all these three texts refer to same kinds of stories intermingled with fantasies and famines and so on and so forth, but all of them refer to monks undertaking pilgrimage to see the Botri in what we refer to as Bodh Gaya today. So these stories are then from about Anuradhapura period right up to the Dambadeniya period, right? Most of these stories are rewritten in what is known as the Saddharma Alankara, which was composed in Sinhala. Earlier three were in Pali. Saddharma Alankara is in Sinhala. And in much more detail than the earlier three texts, it gives this constant references to pilgrim travel, always by monks, not by regular people. Now, one can say, given the nature of these stories, because when you are crossing the ocean, there are sea monsters that come up and so on and so forth. So you can always say these are mythological stories. Don't take them seriously and so on and so forth. But I also came across something called the Dambadeva Alankara, which is also written in the Dambadeniya period, which is effectively a travel guide. It is not a mythological kind of narrative. It actually tells you the distances between different pilgrim sites at that time. And it doesn't give the distances in the car. And it says, as the crow would fly, that kind of references. And it's a very short reference. It's a very short text, about 490 words in Sinhala. Now, when I was confronted with these texts, I was fairly convinced that even though I started this whole thing, assuming that pilgrim travel as we understand it today comes from the 19th century, but there were these references from the Anuradhapura period downwards. But then whether any of these are whether they can be taken more seriously in terms of facts. That is when I came across these the scholars who knew better than me, who pointed me to a number of Chinese records from 8th century onwards. And the Chinese records are very clear about consistent travel by Sri Lankan monks, again, only monks, to these Buddhist pilgrim places over a very long period of time. Not only that, some of you may have heard of a king in the Anuradhapura period called Kirti Sri Meghavarna. He is known in Sinhala as Kitsiri Mevan. Now, these Chinese records refer to a monastery that he has built on the outskirts, just immediately outside the Mahabodhi temple, for his monks, because for Sri Lankan monks to stay when they went on pilgrimage. So these were, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, these were not only stories that seem to be somewhat mythological, these are also references to actual physical efforts that have been done. Now, the first Chinese records for this construction come about 300 years after it was initially built. But still, the king's name was known. And we know that he was a contemporary of Samudragupta, and Samudragupta is also referred to in these texts. So the point I want to make is quite simply that when I'm talking about contemporary practices today, and when I go back to the past, and of course I was not going to go to the Anuradhapura period, but when I go to this past, I know that the practice that we see today is not something that happened in the colonial period, is not something completely contemporary. And I also wonder when Sri Lankan government goes around building pilgrim rests in different parts of India, Delhi is one, Varanasi, and also in Lumbini, whether by whether, whether they are actually following in the footsteps of somebody like Kitsirima. And I don't want to say this too much in public because these guys might actually go and quote me and then start building more of these things. But the point is, it is I have not been able to put my finger on it yet, but there is this correlation, and I would not have found that if I didn't go to the past. And the last thing I want to say is this. Now, if somebody like Professor Sudarshan Seneviratne or Professor Indrapala undertook my study, they would have known this material immediately because these guys know these texts. Whereas when I started, I didn't know anything, which is why I keep saying that into this conversation you have to bring people who have a more I would say a stronger handle on formal historiography, right? So the last thing I want to say again, Hasini, is that that is something that if there is an afterlife of this, you should probably look into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sasanka. In fact, your suggestion is really spot on. We were in touch with Professor Sudarshan Seneviratne. In fact, he is somebody whom I greatly admire, but we caught him in a difficult window because, as you know, he was taking up his position as the ambassador for Bangladesh in Dhaka within the time period. But he was definitely one of our top of our list to engage in this kind of conversations. And let's hope that we are able to continue. The feedback that we are getting is very positive in terms of the interest that the public is showing on building more awareness about the issues that we are talking about. So let's hope that we can continue this discussion, bringing in people who really can add value to such a discussion. So thank you for that very very valid suggestion from your side. So I'm going to start the Q&A at the moment. So just a reminder that please do type in the questions in any language that you wish to ask the question in. And although we will answer it in English, you will still be able to follow the interpretation in Sinhala and Tamil in the channels. So please also vote for the questions you want to ask most. So I'm just inviting all of you to raise questions. Meanwhile, I have a question to ask Sasanka to start off with, because I felt you were very sharp in observing how there are silences in the past. And I would like to ask, start off by asking, how do we manage these silences, or how do we interpret these silences about ordinary people, silences about women in history? Do you have any thoughts on that?
See, I think we have to, there are two big silences as far as the past is concerned in generally, and certainly in our case. And those two silences are ordinary folks and women. Of course, there are references to women as long as they acquire political power. The moment they become rulers, then there are references, but they are short references, right? So how do you deal with it? I think the problem that we have had so far is that we have taken the present understanding of the past as for granted. We think it's complete. Simply because we know something about King Duttagamini or King Parakramabahu, we assume, at least at the popular level, I shouldn't put historians into this kind of thing, but at the popular level, we assume that we know about Anuradhapura and Polonnaru. We don't. My sense is always that if you are, or you look at Sigiriya that you recently talked about. I mean, imagine what level of coercion must have been needed and control to construct that place. But today we talk about it in very romantic terms. No, Kashyapa as this very romantic king who was into painting and so on and so forth. It's not that simple. I am not saying that somebody like Jagat will make it simplistic, but what I'm trying to say is that that is the popular assumption of that past. Because we take it for granted. We assume that once we are looking at Sigiriya, it is about Kashyapa, but it is not. So unless you ask these questions, those silences will not be addressed, right? Oh my God, there are a lot of
Thank you.
things
Thank you.
coming up.
So we have quite a few questions coming up. There is a question from Jude Fernando, which is basically about the ideas, the similarities about the ideas between Thapar and Walter Benjamin. If I read it out to you, it's your ideas are exactly the ideas found in Romila Thapar's Past as Present.
Ah, yes.
Are there fundamental differences between Thapar and Walter Benjamin? I mean, the way in the way you interpret them. This is by Jude Fernando question.
Yeah. I don't think there are. I mean, I know that Professor Thapar is familiar with Benjamin, so there's no way she will miss something like this. But you're right. I mean, my influence comes from two sources. One is the book you referred to, and as well as Benjamin. But and we have revisited this whole question about the past in the present in the case of India's history in a conversation that with Romila Thapar that my department organized a few years ago. Is a very small, I mean, this is the other thing that now Professor Thapar's the past in the present, past as the present is a very thick book. Now, I mean, I don't know whether at the popular level, whether you can expect normal people to read this kind of thing, but the conversation we did is a very small thing. It was a conversation between Professor Thapar and Rustam Barucha that I edited. I mean, I'm willing to send it to anybody who wants it by email because this is how we were asking the kinds of questions that Jude is asking from one of the most eminent living historians, right? Who's also not very popular, by the way, because of her interpretations of the past. So so basically, I don't think there are any fundamental differences, except that in the case of Romila, what she has done is to bring this discourse right to South Asia and in particular to India. This thing about the ways in which the past is always in the present. Okay.
Yes. So there's a question by Madhubhashini Ratnayaka. Do you think translating the seminal work into Sinhala or Tamil will be enough to popularize some ideas that everyone will benefit by knowing? Isn't academia anyway a bit removed from people who might truly benefit by knowing some of these concepts? Is there any way in which we can get rather academic ideas into the general imagination? So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think academia is very boring. And I am seriously thinking of retiring now and starting up something far more pragmatic like your field except I don't have the talent, but seriously, academia cannot go beyond a point. For me, if we are looking at the past as the discourses of the past in the present as a necessary political engagement, then it cannot be done with academia. All I'm saying is that serious academic research must be the basis of that, but that cannot do the politics, right? So the way in which you engage with the population, the way in which you engage with the normal people is by bringing that material into something that is more comprehensible. That means things like this, a conversation, but hopefully in Sinhala and Tamil. And in English and in YouTube, I mean, look at the popularity of the videos that are being done on history. Some of them are absolutely crazy. completely wacko histories, but they are very popular, right? I mean, you will remember that some years ago, many years ago, there was a very popular Sinhala language television program on history hosted by this actor Jackson Anthony, very popular. But then it was too popular, and I think this was. I never saw people like Professor Indrapal or Sudarshan Senevirat in that program, which is very interesting. We saw far more popular and populist commentators on history, right? So what I'm trying to say, Madhu, is that these conversations have to be brought to a much more tangible, popular conversation, right? Academia to me is only the base, but you can't bring anything into the popular discourse without that kind of a robust base. My concern now is that the base itself is not robust enough, or that we do not know it well enough. And that is why I think the seminal texts have to be brought into, not necessarily the seminal text, some selected texts from the English to the two local languages to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really needed, and this is also where fiction can play a role and contribute to the discussion. Not just fiction, I think popular teledrama. If you look at it, there are currently quite a few teledramas airing about Pandukavya and all of that. You know, so this is how it is being generated. So I'm turning to a question by Vihenga Pereira. As I see it, political agendas, especially that of the nation building and the nationalist rhetoric, seem to prefer to keep the past in the past and polarize these complex historical patterns. How can we practically rally against this? How can we broaden this kind of awareness that is happening in esoteric spaces? I'm sure he's referring to our little small bubble here.
I don't think the state is imprisoning the past in the past. It is bringing it into the present, but it brings to the present what it wants to be brought to the present, right? So, for example, this particular way of looking at this this well-known war between these two kings is very much in the present. It's in a number of textbooks and so on and so forth. So it has been brought, but what has not been brought into the present at the same time is the fact that after he was killed in battle, Dutugamanu is supposed to have built this big monument for him and decreed, according to the Mahavamsa, that anybody who comes anywhere near it, I mean, he gives some distances, you must get off your horses, you must take your hats off, and you must stop your music, right? Now, see, that is not brought to the present. Right, so it is not that the past is imprisoned in the present is not. It is brought to the past is brought to the present, but in packages that are useful. So I think the way in which to deal with it is, I mean, there is no point in negating the past. I mean, I always found it, there is a bandwagon now in our country who thinks Mahavamsa is a useless text. No, I do not subscribe to that. You have to know how to read these texts, right? You also have to know how to identify the silences. So similarly, if we look at our past in terms of, let's say, whatever is available, then this could be Sinhala material, this could be Indian material, this could even be from the Kandyan period onwards, Portuguese and Dutch material. It's quite fascinating to see how cosmopolitan our society was, particularly at the Kandyan period. But when we look at the past today, the Kandyan past, we think it's a beautiful Sinhala Buddhist space. It was, but there were all these other people. There were Turks, there were Muslims, there were Brahmins, and so on and so forth in Vimal Dharma Surya's court. I mean, this recent book by Garanath Obesekar actually sketches some of these things quite well with reference to contemporary sources. So my suggestion is this, when a government or an interested party, which could be either nationalism in this country, brings a particular version of the past into our conversations, we have to also always ask what is not being brought and see, if possible, whether those silencers can be given some kind of voice, right? And I think it is possible to a large extent, as long as we have good historians doing their work. Now, that is another question you should ask, whether we have um, serious historians doing their work.
We have a very interesting question by Eva Ambos. You've referred to contemporary experiences and also emotions as shaping our ideas about the past. Could you elaborate a bit on it from a methodological point of view? How to capture these emotions, and related to the current context, which emotions and experiences do you see at the moment as central in shaping the ideas about the past?
See, I think why I took that example of this particular conflict with this war between these two kings and the different in temperament in which it is recorded in these three Pali chronicles is to make precisely that point, and that is we are that if we take Sirivira's article, and I think that is also something that we should excavate. It's very difficult to find now, and even I don't have it, but it was available in all three languages at one point. And this is one thing that you should probably locate and translate. But anyway, Sirivira's article was that emotions of those particular periods played a role in the nature of the compilation and the tempo. That is it, right? So I'm simply saying it's the same thing today. Because when, I mean, we do have anxiety between, among ethnic groups. We had a war that lasted for 30 years. So it is commonsensical that that popular level of popular historiography cannot avoid that emotion. So that is one. That this whole conflict between Tamil and Sinhala nationalisms is playing a part in the way we see the past, right? So that is one emotion, one big cluster of emotions. The other, right now, I think we also don't, we all know that we have, there are serious issues in the way the country and the government and so on and so forth deals with minorities, particularly the Muslims right now. And I'm fascinated at the way in which the Muslim past is actually not in our conscience. Not in the conscience of the Sinhalas and not in the conscience of Muslims too, right? So I find it fascinating when the British refer to this Riddhi Vihara, which still exists, by the way, in Kurunegala, where, you know, the Riddhi Vihara allowed the Muslim tenants who were chased away by the Dutch to settle down there, and the Buddhist landlord in that area set up a farm with the earnings of which they were supporting a priest for this Muslim clientele in this village called Ramukanda, which still exists. But 10 years ago, when I went to the temple and asked the monk about this story, he knew. But when I asked the young Muslims, they did not know. Older ones knew, right? So what I'm trying to say is that these are the emotions. So for a number of reasons, different people do not bring these the certain memories of the past into the present because the emotions block, right? So now, if our relationships with Muslims is the way it is, then maybe hegemonic kind of Sinhala thinking will also block our past away from Muslims. So would some of the Muslims, right? Because everybody wants to invent their own kind of identity and past. That has nothing to do with the other. I hope I answered that in some sense.
Thank you. So I'm just reminding quickly to everyone that the box that you have to use to ask question is actually called the Q&A. Please don't type in the chat because very fast and we are unable to keep track of the questions, so we might lose your question. So please do type your questions in the Q&A box so that we are able to handle the questions systematically. I have a quick question, Sasanka. This one is about resources. Hold on. What resources, including texts, would you suggest for researchers who are not formally trained as historians, who nevertheless engage in historical research for interdisciplinary work? This is raised by Takshala Tisera.
So he or she mentions text, and is something else mentioned too?
No, resources, including text. So what
including text.
Resources can you?
It depends who will to whom you pose that question. Now, if you pose it to an archaeologist, they will refer to these kinds of written texts as well as the archaeological record. Someone like me would probably be more comfortable dealing with written texts, whether they are inscriptions or whether they are actually books and manuscripts and so on and so forth. So it depends who you pose that question to, because my training is inadequate for me to look at the archaeological record, right? So someone like Sudarshan Seneviratne would have been he would have had a broader take on the past. But I think the written text also, there are lots of things that we simply don't realize, texts themselves. Now, as I think my second part was probably pretty chaotic. At least I was trying to reduce 80 pages of what I have written into like 10 minutes. So, but the point is this: there was some of these material, like the Chinese records I refer to. If anybody is interested, I can send you the books. These things are so freely available on the internet. There is specifically something called the Gutenberg Project, right? It's an online library. All Mahavamsa is there, Deepavamsa is there, all these Chinese records I'm referring to are there. It's free to download. And it's incredible collection of Robert Knox's book is there, right? But you have to me, the problem is not about accessing resources right now. I mean, a lot of these are actually accessible. The problem is that I don't think our universities are creative enough in creating the kind of mind frame or curiosity or intellectual rebelliousness in our minds to go and look for these things. That I think is to me is the problem. Because otherwise, now, I also was educated at least partly in this country. And I know for a fact that none of the things that I'm referring to today, I learned from here. I didn't even learn it in my PhD program. I have learned it by messing around, by asking the wrong kind of questions from people, like conversations, and to people like, actually I learned a lot in this conversation with Professor Thapa with this 2-3 years ago. Because I was not from that discipline. So the point is, I think we have to retrain ourselves to look at things differently from what our disciplines have told us. So even though I started by saying I'm a sociologist, I don't think people practice sociology like this. They would probably tell me you are methodologically very messy. You bring too many things from. I think that is my. At this stage, I can do all these things. So who's going to punish me? But if you are young, if you are starting in a university career at this, then one has to be very careful. They would say, what is historical in this? Or what is sociological in this? That kind of question. But material resources, textual resources are widely available. There's many things. I mean, if you are looking at Ola leaf manuscripts, then it's going to be difficult, because quite a bit have been stolen by the British and the Dutch and so on and so forth, and they are in those repositories in those countries. So now it's going to be very difficult to access those. But you would be surprised at the number of things that are actually freely available, and one has to actually start looking.
Thank you, Sasanka. We have a question in Tamil by Muhammad Salim Fatima Sifaya, if I'm reading the name correctly. An interesting question again. What does the past mean in your opinion? So to repeat the question, what does the past mean in your opinion? This is how this is translated to me into English. I hope I have done a correct translation of it.
I mean, that can take another 2 hours.
Yes.
That to me is an intriguing question. I can simply say the past doesn't mean anything to me and stop it there. But see, who knows? Past is, all I can tell you is this. We have been trained to believe that the past is a very clear thing, right? That is what our ancestors have told us. That is what our textbooks are. Don't believe that, right? Past is not that simple. That is all I tried to say today, right? And if you come up with the if you convince yourself that the past has many interpretations depending on how you look at material and what material you look at, then I think you're on safe ground. So I would say a short answer to that short question is past is many things, right? It is not just one thing. So if I want to say, let's go back to the most recent of our past before colonialism, to the Kandyan period. If you want to say that it was a kind of a very strong Sinhala Buddhist enclave, there are lots of evidence to show that, right? But if you also want to show that that period was also a time of religious tolerance, there's a lot of evidence to show that too. Because after all, Joseph Vass, the Goan Christian Catholic missionary, had free access to the Kandyan kingdom, right? But that you will only be able to show if you are looking at particular kind of sources, right? So all I'm saying is, look at the past as a plural thing, as something that is not just one. So if you look at different sources, you will be seeing different things, right? So in this context, I think this recent tiny book by Obesekara, I forget what it's called, Many Faces of the Kandyan Kingdom, very useful. It's very useful as an introductory text, because for me, what was useful was actually the sources to which you can go. You don't have to depend on what Professor Obesekara is saying. Go to the sources, right? And you'll see a different past. All right.
So Sasanka, we have 2 questions from Avanti. Basically, again, about the silences. The first one is a rather long one, so bear with me as I read it out to you. First question is, there are also a few kings whose names come in some of these historical, such as within the Vallavaya Arungambe stretch, like the Mahadatika Mahanaga in these excavation sites. Mm-hmm. They might have actually contributed to these physical structures or may not, but there is also silence imposed on some of these figures who were in power and might not be as popular as someone like Duttugam. How do we understand these silences around those who were in power, but their role in history has been undermined by larger figures? So that's the first question. May I also read the second so that you sort of answer them together? The second question by Avanti is, how do you also understand how history has glorified violence and these major battles in these narrative? I think that's a very important question as well.
The first one
is about exactly the selection of figures.
I think there are lots of histories that we simply don't know about, and you just gave some very good examples, right? And some of these characters do not even come to main historical chronicles because they were regional kings, right? I think one way, a recent example of looking at these kinds of what I would call micro histories is an effort by, I think it was, either SSA or ICS, one of these entities, did this series of publications by I think Gananath Obesekar, I think, who collected these texts, singular texts called Kada Impot. These are simply books on village boundaries. Kada Impot literally means book of boundaries, right? Now, if you, I mean, see, nobody reads these things, but now it's available in edited Sinhala. It's very easy to read. But if you read these things, you actually get the kind of micro histories of these little places, which nobody talks about. It's not in the Mahavamsa, it's not in our inscription, nothing. It's the kind of thing that you just referred to. Even more micro than that. You know, these are not about kings. These are about regular people, where they came from, what are the borders, how many people, and you read these things, you get a sense of, you know, for example, there are all sorts of references to something called Brahmin. And one of the things is we know that in the Sinhala society, this whole Brahmin, what is known as Bamunu in Sinhala, that Brahmin presence has completely disappeared. But there are all sorts of reference to it in our ritual practices. So what has happened to these guys? There are a lot of references to Vedas settling down and becoming Sinhala effectively over time in these Kada imports. So these are, so basically the short answer to your question is this: there are these any number of these kinds of micro histories or histories that have been underemphasized for various reasons. Sometimes it's just being forgetful as well. But there are ways in which to unravel these things, because it's not that references are not there. In some cases, incomplete, but another silence is the history of Mahayana in this country.
Exactly.
Now, hey, nobody talks about it because this is, you know, it's the ultimate Theravada thing. You don't want to say that Mahayana had a presence in our country, but then look at the Mahayana monuments in our country. In Buttala, for example, all of those temples were Mahayana temples, and this temple, this monastery that I was referring to in my text, in my historical kind of escapade into the past, built by King Kitsirimevan in Gaya. At the time, these Chinese travelers were referring to it in 300 years after it was built. They were actually referring to it as what we now might call the Mahayana temple. But they was very specific that it was Sri Lankan, in the sense that the monks were from that island. That's what they were saying. So that is also a silence. So the only way in which you can bring these silences into the present or into conversations is simply to make sure that there is research on them. And that is why ideally we need robust history departments in universities, and my contention is we don't have them, right? I mean, I don't know who Avanti is, but if she's a history person, then I mean, these are the kinds of questions that history department should be asking. But then nowadays, who takes history seriously? This is the kind of thing that our political leaders would say are subjects that doesn't have a demand, right? So what do you do? But all I'm trying to, anyway, let me stop.
Yeah.
So, there was another question.
There are two more questions. There are two more questions.
Let me answer that thing about violence. Glorifying history. I don't know whether, see, this is again a contemporary take on things. If you look at the same examples that I referred to, this is not necessarily about a glorification of violence as such, but this is the way in which some of these things were seen at that time. Glorification will come from today, right? So if now, for example, there are all kinds of interpretations about the monks telling Dutugamunu, don't worry about all those people you killed, only 1.5 people died. I mean, I don't want to go into that whole discourse, but that is not necessarily a glorification of violence in the way we understand it today. These are probably monks who are trying to placate the conscience of the king, in the same way that you have similar stories associated with Emperor Asoka as well. How did he become Dharmashoka when he was known as Chandashoka? It's a very similar story. So I see, one is, if you are looking at it from the present, these kinds of things, you are interpreting these things in the discourse of today's conversations. But if you think, now what I have done is this: whenever I have been confronted with this kind of thing, when I was teaching in Sri Lanka, I used to say, listen, this is what the Mahavamsa says, particularly about this 1.5 death, the death of 1.5 people in the Dutugamnu's battle. I used to say that this is not a Buddhist position. That you should be able to make very clear, right? And also the Mahavamsa says, on the other hand, that it was very difficult for the soldiers to recognize each other because they were the same, right? What does it say? What does it mean? It's not about my interpretation, or this is probably talking to, this is probably a reference to the fact that Elara had single soldiers in his army. If you take it, it's not about what they were wearing, right? So we should be able to make certain points, but also we should not go overboard. My concern is that we are sometimes looking at these things as we are looking at the present. We are not, right?
Exactly. So I think we have only time for 2 more questions, and I will take the 2 that I have selected at the moment. So one is from Vivi Marie Madavathagedara. So she is saying, I was very interested in your observation about contemporary pilgrims from Sri Lanka taking their own food, etc., when they visit Buddhist India. I am sure you were aware of an ongoing conversation that the Buddha was born in Sri Lanka. This very famous popular discussion. It had to come up, and I'm glad it has. Do you know anything about the roots of this theory, which seems to be a step ahead of taking Sri Lanka across transnational borders? In other words, bringing the Buddha to Sri Lanka and transforming history of Buddhist India. So that's also a very interesting way of phrasing that question, Vivi. So thank you anyway for bringing it up.
And trust Vivi Marie to bring that thing also. No, I interviewed about 2 people on this when I was doing this pilgrim thing, but I very consciously stopped doing that, because I thought this is a completely new thing, which is for me a completely different research project, because I did not want to mix up the 2. But I can tell you what is happening. Okay, I'll tell you what my question. So they were basically saying what you just said, and that is the Buddha is Sri Lankan, he's Sinhala, he was born here, and his enlightenment was not in Bodh Gaya, it's probably someplace in Anuradhapura, Kandy, or Ampara, and so that whole circuit is reinvented in Sri Lanka. So what they were telling me is, you don't have to go to India and Nepal, it's right here. So then I asked this simple question: how is it that for these 2000 odd years that the whole world has believed that the Buddha was born in what is today referred to as Nepal, and then he was traveling mostly in what is today known as Bihar? Then he had a very interesting explanation. He said, well, all the Sinhala texts which referred to the local Buddha have been translated wrongly into Pali from Sinhala and burnt. So then what do you do? So they have an answer to that. Of course, that is not a historical or a sensible scientific answer. It is the sort of thing that people who have faith in this kind of thing will believe. Now, but of course, if you look at the internet presence on this whole argument, huge following. Many of them very urban people. So at the moment, I know there is this dynamic, but I don't know how this has been figured. But I think one thing that comes across clearly to me in these two conversations I had, and it's not enough for me to make generalizations, is that there is a very inherent anti-Indian sensibility also in this. Now, whether that has come from the present because of experiences of a few people, or whether it has come from some kind of past experience or perceived past experience, that I'm not sure. Now, one of the things I have heard again in these two interviews is that, see, we have to be very careful with that country when you are going. After all, our king Ravana was attacked by them. So I said, listen, we are talking about a story. No, I said, no, that is history. So you see that there is there is a very clear antagonism. But I don't want to get into it because I don't think I know enough. But it's an interesting phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, so there's one before the last question, and I actually found a fairly nice question to end, but this is the one before the last, raised by Prabhu Mihindukula Surya. So he's asking, bona fide academic work can be misused by either majority as well as minority ethno-religious nationalists. For example, he's giving an example of your own work of religious conversion in Sri Lanka and Nepal was used by anti-conversion advocates to target Christian groups. What can academic historians do to minimize this tendency, since it cannot be entirely prevented?
I think this is one of those issues that he's absolutely right. My work has been misused, and I was quite upset. And when I first heard about it, I actually wrote something to the island, and I'm pretty sure they published it at that time about. See, this is a risk that is always there, and if, for example, if I take the same example that Mr. Mihindukula Surya is giving, if the entirety of my work was taken, those arguments could not have been made that were made. But the point is, people usually make use of academic texts or any other kind of formal text to pursue their own arguments, taking them out of context. This is what this is the way in which even religious texts have been used for justifying violence, right? People keep on asking me, and you will see this in the discourse, global discourse on Islam. If you read Edward Said's Covering Islam, for example, people make this equation between Islam and terrorism and saying Islam is a very violent religion. So I keep telling some of these guys, you tell me in the Quran, if you have read it, what is it that it tells you the ways in which it justifies violence? I think it's too simplistic to just to refer to jihad. It's a very specific category. But there are lots of people who have interpreted very simple aspects of religious positions, whether it's Buddhism or Islam, to support their own causes. Now, I remember in the 90s when I was doing work on justification of violence in Sri Lanka, I came across this lecture by one of our well-known commentators saying that the prohibition in Buddhism against killing is applicable only to monks. It is not applicable to regular people. And when I was trying to figure out why, I realized because it's a very difficult position for Buddhist soldiers who go and kill in war, to say that this is okay, because in terms of religious ethics, it is not okay. But in terms of war, it's a different matter. So what I'm trying to say is this: there will always be people who will be misinterpreting what we write out of context. It will always be out of context. Right? It's never going to be in context. Only thing you can do is to intervene if that happens. As a scholar, I would always do that if I know about it. But then most of the time we will not know about it. So the only other way to be foolproof is for you to do nothing. That is, don't do scholarship, don't do research, and so on. Now that is also not tenable, no? So I think that this is the kind of a risk that one has to take, but I try to be That is one reason I don't do this kind of work now. I deal with art and photography nowadays because hopefully there will be less abuse. But this is a serious problem.
Okay, so in order to close the session, I'm going to actually combine two questions into one because they are also going in the similar direction. One is by Harshana Tushara de Silva, who is asking about teaching humanities subjects in a critical manner and your thoughts on that. And then a question from Jude Fernando asking whether reading the past is essentially a moral act or the moral dimension of it. So with those two questions, I hope you can wrap up and yes.
What is Harshana's question?
So Harshana's question is about teaching history as a critical subject. He is referring to your own comments on how politicians also ignore and that subjects like history are actually marginalized within academic disciplines.
Okay, Jude, about this moral thing, I mean, this is a philosophical question, and I think we'll have to have a conversation on it. I don't think I'm going to get into answering that. But it is a moral issue too, obviously, that I can say. But it is not just that, you know. It is also a political issue. It is also a common sense issue. It's a quotidian issue too, right? But fundamentally, it's a moral issue, right? So let's discuss this some other time. Now about humanities, Arshana, I mean, it's not just the politicians who have downgraded our humanities. No, I think the practitioners of humanities have also mediocratized their own practice. By and large, I have written about it. I can send you what I wrote. Because we don't have a critical social science or humanities practice in Sri Lanka in general. And I will always make a distinction between a handful of individuals in these disciplines who are trying to swim against the current sort of thing. But if you look at departments, if you look at programs, then we don't have a self-reflective or critical humanities for sure. I mean, the last time I made this statement was 2 weeks ago in this keynote thing at Rona University. And it is, but the point is, without having a critical as well as a self-reflective, not only humanities, but also social sciences, I don't think our universities would be dynamic places. I mean, my whole argument for the last few years have been that the downgrading of humanities and social sciences by the policymakers, as well as the recognition of that downgrading by the regular people, populace, and our colleagues in these disciplines not dealing with it has created a very serious situation. So we don't have a very robust humanities or social science programs. I think in the case of social sciences, it's probably worse because it has become, in certain ways, I mean, at least in sociology, it has become a kind of a data gathering practice by and large. It doesn't have the kind of critical engagement that you saw associated with the Department of Sociology in Peradeniya University up to the 1960s, or I would say early 1970s. Now, of course, these are also very unpopular things to say, but yes. So unless people, I believe in individuals now. So when I'm saying these things, I'm talking about the general trends. But if individuals try to deal with it, bring that criticality and self-reflection into their practice, if individuals bring a few others and organize some kind of thinking as a collective, I think that is the way to go. You can't expect the university system to do it as an institutional practice. I don't think that is going to happen. All right.
So yeah, so thank you, Sasanka, and I think that brings us to a very good first innings of the webinar series.